The silence was oppressive, a void that pressed in on David from all sides. His breathing, amplified by the confines of his helmet, was the only sound accompanying him now, a rhythmic, mechanical hiss that served as a cruel reminder of his solitude. He had been left behind, abandoned. The intergalactic fleet, with its massive warships and endless squadrons of soldiers, had vanished into the vastness of space, their engines roaring as they breached the atmosphere and disappeared into the star-speckled abyss. He had screamed into his comms until his throat burned, demanding acknowledgement, pleading for rescue. But there had been no response, no hesitation in their departure, just cold silence. David stood motionless for a moment longer, staring at the empty sky where the fleet had been only minutes before. His fists clenched tightly around his rifle as a wave of anger and despair surged through him. How could they have left him? A soldier. No, a man was supposed to mean more than this. He wasn't just a cog in the machine. He wasn't expendable. And yet, here he was, stranded on an alien world with no backup, no extraction plan, and no idea what lay ahead. He forced himself to take a deep breath, steadying the storm inside him. Panic wouldn't help. Survival training kicked in like a reflex, pushing aside emotion with cold logic. First things first, assess the situation. The planet around him was strange. Beautiful but strange. The sky above shimmered in hues that defied easy description. Violet streaks blending seamlessly into gold and orange as twin suns dipped low on opposite horizons. The air smelled faintly sweet, tinged with something metallic that tickled his senses but wasn't unpleasant. Towering trees surrounded him, their trunks gleaming like polished metal under the fading light, while their leaves glowed faintly with bioluminescence. The ground beneath his boots was soft and springy, covered in a moss-like substance that pulsed faintly as if alive. David checked his gear with practiced efficiency. Rifle operational, but with limited energy reserves. Sidearm functional. Survival knife sharp. Rations enough for maybe a week if he stretched them. Water purifier intact. Emergency beacon active, but likely useless given how far out this planet was from established trade routes or colonies. He was alone, completely and utterly alone. Or so he thought. The first sign came as a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, a shadow darting between the trees too quickly for him to get a clear look. David froze instantly, every muscle tensing as he scanned the area around him. His visor enhanced the dim light, but there was nothing there now except swaying branches and rustling leaves stirred by an unseen breeze. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He pressed forward cautiously, every step deliberate and measured as he moved through the dense forest. The silence around him felt unnatural now, not peaceful but predatory, like something unseen was holding its breath just out of sight. Then they appeared. At first, it was just one figure stepping out from behind a tree, a silhouette against the glowing foliage. But soon others followed until they surrounded him completely. They were tall, taller than any human woman David had ever seen, and impossibly graceful in their movements, as though they floated rather than walked. Their skin shimmered faintly under the fading light, marked with intricate patterns that glowed softly, like living tattoos etched into their flesh by some ancient hand. And they were all women. David's heart pounded in his chest as he raised his hands slowly in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. His rifle hung uselessly at his side. Even if he wanted to fight, and he didn't, it would be suicide against so many of them. "I come in peace," he said aloud, his voice sounding small and hollow against the vastness of this alien wilderness. The women exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them in an instant, before one stepped forward from their ranks. She was taller than the rest by at least half a head and carried herself with an air of authority that needed no translation. Her posture was regal, her gaze piercing as if she could see straight through him to every secret he'd ever tried to hide. When she spoke, her voice was melodic yet commanding, a strange blend of music and steel that sent shivers down David's spine even before his translator began struggling to parse her words into something intelligible. "Man, alone, why? David hesitated for only a moment before answering carefully, choosing each word with precision despite the adrenaline coursing through him like liquid fire. "My people left me behind," he said finally, forcing himself to meet her gaze even though it felt like staring into twin suns. "I'm just trying to survive." The woman studied him for what felt like an eternity before nodding slightly, a gesture that seemed more like acknowledgement than agreement, and gestured for him to follow her deeper into their territory. The group turned as one and began moving back into the forest without waiting to see if he would comply. Their movements were fluid, yet purposeful, like predators who knew they ruled this land completely. David hesitated only briefly before falling in a step behind them. What choice did he have? Alone out here against whatever dangers this planet harbored would be suicide. At least with these women there might be safety or answers. As they walked deeper into the forest together under skies painted gold and violet by twin suns setting on opposite horizons above them all, David couldn't shake off an overwhelming sense creeping over him now. He wasn't just stranded anymore. He'd stumbled into something far larger than himself entirely, something ancient yet alive still. And whatever it wasn't going anywhere soon. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of glowing trees and softly humming plants that pulsed with an inner light. David followed the group of alien women in silence, his boots crunching softly against the mossy ground. They moved with a fluidity that made him feel clumsy, their steps barely disturbing the environment around them. He kept his rifle slung across his back, his hands open and visible. The last thing he wanted was to give them a reason to see him as a threat. The leader, the tall woman with the glowing tattoos and piercing gaze, glanced back at him occasionally, her expression unreadable. David couldn't help but feel like a specimen under observation, like some strange creature dragged in from the wilds for study. He didn't know if they were leading him to safety or to his execution, but he didn't have much choice either way. Alone, he wouldn't last long on this planet. Eventually, they emerged into a clearing where towering stone structures rose from the forest floor like ancient monuments. The architecture was unlike anything David had ever seen, elegant and organic, as though the buildings had grown out of the earth rather than been constructed. Soft lights glowed from within the structures, illuminating the area in a warm, golden hue. The air here felt different too, charged with an energy that made his skin tingle. The women led him into one of the larger buildings, its entrance flanked by two massive statues of armored figures wielding weapons that looked both ceremonial and deadly. Inside, the space opened into a grand hall filled with more of these alien women. Their eyes turned toward him as he entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. David felt their stares like a weight pressing down on him. The leader raised a hand, and the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the crowd fell silent instantly. She turned to face him fully now, her gaze sharp and assessing. When she spoke, her voice carried through the hall with authority. "Man," she said simply, her translator struggling to keep up with her alien tongue. "Why here? Why alone?" David hesitated for only a moment before answering. He had nothing to hide. Not really, and lying seemed like a bad idea when he was so clearly outnumbered and outmatched. "I was left behind," he said honestly, his voice steady despite the nerves coiling in his stomach. "My people abandoned me during an evacuation." There was a ripple of movement among the gathered women, small gestures and exchanged glances that David couldn't interpret but felt significant nonetheless. The leader tilted her head slightly, as if weighing his words. "You fight?" she asked after a moment. David nodded slowly. "I'm a soldier." Her eyes narrowed slightly at that, and for a brief moment, he thought he'd made a mistake admitting it. But then she gestured toward one of the other women, a younger-looking one with sharp features and glowing markings that seemed brighter than most of the others. The younger woman stepped forward, her expression hard and challenging. "Show," the leader said simply. David blinked in confusion. "Show what?" The leader gestured again, this time toward his rifle. Understanding dawned on him slowly. They wanted to see what he could do. He unslung his weapon carefully, making sure not to move too quickly or in any way that might be interpreted as threatening. The younger woman stepped back slightly, but didn't flinch, Her confidence was unshaken despite whatever she thought of him or his weapon. David scanned the room for something to use as a target and spotted a small decorative vase sitting on a ledge near one wall. It wasn't ideal. It was beautiful in its own alien way, but it would have to do. "I'll aim for that," he said aloud, pointing toward the vase so there would be no misunderstanding. The leader nodded once in approval. David took aim, steadying himself with practiced ease despite the tension crackling through the air around him like static electricity. His finger tightened on the trigger, and then there was a sharp crack as energy surged from his rifle in a bright beam of light that struck the vase dead center. It shattered instantly into shimmering fragments that scattered across the floor like pieces of broken starlight. The room fell silent again, except for faint whispers among some of the women at the edges of the crowd. David lowered his rifle slowly and looked back at the leader. She studied him for what felt like an eternity before nodding again, this time more deeply, and saying something in her language that didn't translate fully but carried an unmistakable tone of approval. Over time, days or maybe weeks, it was hard to tell without any familiar markers of time on this alien world, the women began to warm to him. They watched him closely at first as though expecting him to reveal some hidden savagery or brutishness, but when none came, their wariness began to fade. David showed them how he maintained his gear, cleaning and repairing his weapons with meticulous care, and they seemed impressed by his discipline and precision. He helped them with tasks around their settlement too, lifting heavy objects they struggled with despite their strength, or using tools from his survival kit to solve problems they hadn't encountered before. He learned more about them as well, how their society functioned without men, how they valued strength tempered by wisdom, how they revered their ancestors through rituals involving those glowing tattoos etched into their skin like living memories passed down through generations. And slowly but surely, they began to trust him. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when suspicion flared up again or when misunderstandings threatened to undo all progress. But David remained patient and steady throughout it all because deep down inside himself, he knew one thing above all else. If humanity had taught him anything over centuries upon centuries spent reaching out into endless stars above, it was this simple truth. Survival wasn't just about strength. It was about adaptation too. And if anyone could prove themselves worthy even among such extraordinary beings as these alien Amazons, it would be him. David had never imagined himself here, standing shoulder to shoulder with warriors who were unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. The Amazons of this alien world were a force of nature, swift, deadly, and disciplined in ways that rivaled even the most elite units of the Intergalactic army he had once served. And yet, against all odds, he had earned his place among them. It hadn't been easy. Trust was not given freely in this society of warriors. It was earned through action, through proving oneself again and again under fire and in the heat of battle. David had done so in ways that surprised even himself. He had adapted to their way of life, learning their customs, their combat techniques, and their language, a melodic yet sharp tongue that still tripped him up at times but was slowly becoming second nature. The queen herself, Captain Seris, as she preferred to be called in the field, had taken a particular interest in him. She was the tallest and strongest among them, her glowing tattoos more intricate than any he had seen, marking her as both a leader and a living symbol of their people's history. Her presence commanded respect without effort. Her every movement radiated power and grace. Yet, when she spoke to him, there was a softness beneath the steel, a curiosity that mirrored his own. At first, their interactions had been formal, almost clinical. She had tested him relentlessly, pushing him to his limits both physically and mentally. But over time, as he proved himself again and again, those barriers began to fall away. They began to talk, not just about tactics or missions, but about their lives, their worlds, their dreams. Seris was fascinated by Earth, by humanity's history of struggle and triumph, by the sheer audacity of a species that had clawed its way from the dirt to the stars. And David? He found himself equally fascinated by her. Seris was unlike anyone he had ever known, fierce yet thoughtful, commanding yet compassionate. She carried the weight of her people on her shoulders with a strength that seemed unshakable, but was not without its cracks. In quieter moments, when it was just the two of them sitting by a fire after a long day of training or battle, she would let her guard down ever so slightly. She would tell him stories of her childhood, of the trials she had faced to become queen and captain both, of the burdens she bore for those who followed her. It was during one such moment that David realized just how much he admired her, not just as a leader, but as a person. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He cared for her deeply, perhaps more than he should have. But nothing had happened between them. Not yet. There were moments when the air between them seemed charged with something unspoken, when her gaze lingered on his for just a second too long, or when her hand brushed against his during training or battle preparations. And there were times when she would tease him lightly in her own way, a rare smile curving her lips as she pointed out some mistake he'd made or challenged him to keep up with her in sparring matches. David wasn't sure if it was just camaraderie or something more. He wasn't even sure if he wanted it to be something more, not because he didn't feel drawn to her, but because he knew how complicated such feelings could make things. They were soldiers first and foremost. There was no room for distractions in this life they led. But still, there were moments. The day Seris officially inducted him into her elite troop, the Valkyrian Guard, was one David would never forget. The ceremony took place in the heart of their settlement, beneath the towering statues of ancient queens who had come before her. The entire tribe gathered to witness it, hundreds of warriors standing in silent reverence as Seris stepped forward to place a glowing mark on his arm, a smaller version of the tattoos that adorned their own skin. "This mark binds you to us," she said solemnly as she pressed her hand against his forearm where the mark now glowed faintly against his skin. "You are one of us now, not by blood but by bond." David met her gaze and nodded firmly. "I won't let you down, I know," she replied softly before stepping back and addressing the crowd with a voice that carried across the clearing like thunder. "He has proven himself worthy. Let no one question his place among us." The cheers that erupted were deafening, an overwhelming wave of sound that made David's chest tighten with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. For so long, he had been an outsider here, a stranger trying desperately to survive in an alien world where everything seemed stacked against him. But now he belonged. Life as part of the Valkyrian Guard was grueling, but exhilarating. They trained constantly, sparring with weapons both familiar and alien, running drills through dense forests filled with dangerous creatures, honing their skills until they could move as one seamless unit in battle. David quickly became known for his ingenuity, his ability to think on his feet and adapt to situations others might find impossible. His human perspective brought something new to their tactics, something Seris herself often praised during strategy meetings. "You see things differently," she told him one evening as they stood together overlooking the settlement from atop one of its tallest towers. "It's refreshing." David glanced at her sideways and smirked faintly. "Is that your way of saying I'm unpredictable?" She chuckled, a low, rich sound that sent an unexpected warmth through him, and shook her head slightly. "Perhaps." They stood there in silence for a while after that, watching as the twin moons rose above the horizon and bathed the world below in silver light. "Do you miss your people?" Seris asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. David hesitated before answering honestly. "Sometimes." He glanced at her again and added softly, "But I found something here I didn't have even among my own kind." "And what is that?" she asked without looking at him. "Purpose," he said simply. Seris turned toward him then, her gaze searching his face as though trying to decipher some hidden meaning behind his words. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her because she nodded slightly before turning back toward the horizon. "You're stronger than most men I've known," she said quietly after another long pause. David raised an eyebrow at that, but kept his tone light when he replied. "Is that a compliment?" "Take it however you wish," she said with another faint smile before walking away into the night. And once again, David found himself wondering what exactly lay behind those lingering looks and fleeting smiles, and whether either of them would ever dare cross that unspoken line between duty and desire. David had found something on this alien world that he never thought possible. Peace. Not the fleeting, fragile peace of a soldier between battles, but something deeper, something that felt like it could last. He had a purpose here, a place where he was valued, not just for his skills, but for who he was. And more than that, he had found her. Seris. The queen, the captain, the woman who had once been his harshest critic and now was his closest confidant. Their bond had grown slowly, like a fire kindled from embers, each moment together adding fuel to something neither of them fully acknowledged, but both felt deeply. She challenged him in ways no one else ever had, pushing him to be better, stronger, sharper. And in turn, he brought something to her life that she admitted she hadn't known she needed. Someone who saw her not just as a leader or a symbol, but as a person. They hadn't crossed the line into love, not officially. There were no grand declarations or stolen kisses under the twin moons. But it was there in the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention, in the way her hand lingered on his arm just a moment too long during training, in the way her voice softened when they spoke late into the night about things neither of them would share with anyone else. David didn't need words to know what was growing between them. He felt it every time their eyes met across the battlefield or during quiet moments in the settlement. And though he didn't press her, didn't dare disrupt the delicate balance they had found, he allowed himself to hope that one day, it might become something more. For now, though, he was content. He had his place among the Valkyrian Guard, fighting alongside warriors who had become his family. He had Seris's trust and respect, and perhaps more than that. And for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged. But peace is a fragile thing. The warning came at dawn, or what passed for dawn on this strange world where light bled into the sky in hues of gold and violet. David was standing watch on one of the outer towers when he saw it. A glimmer on the horizon, faint but unmistakable. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the light or some natural phenomenon unique to this planet. But as the minutes passed and the glimmer grew brighter and sharper, dread began to coil in his gut. He activated his comm unit and spoke quickly into it. "This is David on Watchpoint 3. I've got movement on the eastern horizon, possible incoming ships." There was a pause before Seris's voice came through, calm but laced with urgency. "How many?" David adjusted his visor, enhancing the image until he could make out more details. His stomach sank as he counted. "At least 6, no, 8 ships. They're coming in fast." "Stay there," Seris ordered. "I'm on my way." Within minutes, she was beside him on the tower, her presence as commanding as ever despite the early hour and the tension crackling in the air around them. She peered through her own visor at the approaching fleet and frowned deeply. "They're not ours," she said grimly. "Who are they?" David asked. Seris didn't answer immediately. Instead, she activated her own comm and began issuing rapid orders to her officers below. "Sound the alarm. Prepare defenses along the eastern perimeter. I want all squads mobilized within 10 minutes. David watched as warriors poured out of their barracks below like a river of steel and light, their glowing tattoos flickering brighter as they armed themselves for battle. The air filled with the hum of energy weapons being charged and armor being secured, a sound David had grown all too familiar with during his time here. Finally, Seris turned back to him, her expression hard but steady. "They're raiders," she said simply. David's brow furrowed. "Raiders? What do they want?" "Resources," she replied curtly. "Slaves?" Her jaw tightened as she added bitterly. "They've attacked us before." David felt a surge of anger at that, at the thought of these invaders coming here to take what wasn't theirs by force. He clenched his fists tightly at his sides but forced himself to stay calm. "What's their strength?" "Significant," Seris admitted without hesitation. "Their technology is advanced, on par with yours if not superior in some areas. And they have numbers on their side." She glanced at him sharply, then and added, "But we've beaten them before, and we'll beat them again," David said firmly. Seris's lips quirked upwards slightly at that, a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes but still managed to convey something like gratitude or maybe pride. "I'll hold you to that," she said before turning back toward her comm unit to issue more orders. The hours that followed were a blur of activity as preparations for battle ramped up across the settlement. Defensive barriers were reinforced. Traps were laid along likely entry points. Weapons were distributed among those who didn't already have them at hand. David worked tirelessly alongside the others, checking equipment, coordinating strategies with Seris's officers, offering insights from his own experience fighting similar foes during his time with humanity's intergalactic forces. He could feel the tension building around him like an electric charge in the air before a storm, the kind of tension that came when people knew their lives could change irrevocably within hours or even minutes depending on how well they fought and how much luck was on their side. Through it all, Seris remained unshakable, a pillar of strength and determination who inspired everyone around her simply by being present among them rather than issuing orders from some distant command center, as many leaders might have done. David found himself drawn to her even more during these moments, not just because of her beauty or their unspoken connection, but because of what she represented: resilience, courage, hope even in the face of overwhelming odds. As night fell over their world once again, casting long shadows across glowing trees and metallic stone structures alike, David stood beside Seris atop one of their defensive walls, overlooking what would soon become a battlefield. "They'll be here by morning," she said quietly without looking at him. David nodded silently before replying just as softly, "We'll be ready." She glanced at him then, her gaze lingering longer than necessary. And for a brief moment neither spoke, as something unspoken passed between them once again. Something fragile, yet undeniable even amid all this chaos surrounding them both now. And then, just like always before, they turned back toward horizon together, awaiting whatever came next ahead. The horizon burned with the glimmer of approaching ships, their sleek silhouettes cutting through the violet skies like blades. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that wrapped itself around every warrior in the settlement. David stood atop the eastern wall with Seris at his side, her glowing tattoos pulsing faintly in the dim light as she surveyed the incoming fleet. Her expression was calm, but he could see the storm brewing behind her eyes. The weight of command, the knowledge that lives would be lost before this was over. "They're almost here," she said, her voice steady but low. David nodded, gripping his rifle tightly. "We'll hold them off," he said firmly. "We've prepared for this." Seris turned to him then, her piercing gaze locking onto his. For a moment, she said nothing, and David felt as though she was trying to memorize him. Every line of his face, every detail of who he was. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer now. "You've become one of us, David. No matter what happens today, know that you've earned your place here." He swallowed hard, forcing himself to hold her gaze even as his chest tightened with emotion. "And you've given me something I never thought I'd find again: purpose. Family." He hesitated for a moment before adding quietly, "And maybe something more." Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, one that carried both warmth and sadness. "Perhaps," she said simply. Before either of them could say more, a loud alarm blared through the settlement, signaling that the enemy fleet had entered their atmosphere. Warriors scrambled into position along the walls and defensive lines below, their weapons glowing with charged energy as they prepared for the inevitable clash. David turned back toward the horizon, his visor enhancing the view of the incoming ships. There were 8 of them in total, massive vessels bristling with weapons and shields that shimmered faintly in the golden light of the twin suns. They were close now, close enough that he could see smaller craft beginning to detach from their hulls. Dropships filled with raiders ready to descend upon the settlement like vultures. "Here they come," he muttered under his breath. Seris raised her arm high above her head, signaling her warriors to hold their ground. The Valkyrian guard stood ready, a wall of glowing tattoos and gleaming armor that radiated strength and defiance. David felt a surge of pride as he looked at them. These were his people now, and he would fight for them with everything he had. But then something happened. The sky above them lit up suddenly, brighter than any sunrise David had ever seen on this alien world. A deafening roar echoed across the landscape as beams of energy lanced down from above, striking the enemy ships with pinpoint precision. The first ship exploded instantly, a massive fireball that sent debris raining down over the forest below. The second followed moments later, its hull splitting apart as another beam tore through it like paper. "What?" Seris began, but her words were drowned out by another explosion as a third ship was obliterated. David's heart raced as he scanned the skies for the source of this unexpected assault. And then he saw them, sleek gray ships descending from above like avenging angels. His breath caught in his throat as recognition hit him like a thunderbolt. "Those are human ships," he said aloud, disbelief coloring his tone. Seris turned to him sharply. "Your people?" David nodded slowly, unable to tear his eyes away from the scene unfolding before him. The human fleet moved with ruthless efficiency, their weapons tearing through the remaining enemy vessels with ease. Within minutes, all 8 raider ships had been reduced to smoldering wreckage scattered across the forest floor. The dropships never even made it close to landing. As silence fell over the battlefield below, a silence broken only by the distant crackle of flames from burning debris, David's comm unit crackled to life. "David? David Andrews? Is that you?" The voice was familiar, achingly familiar, and it took him a moment to process what he was hearing. "Lieutenant Carter?" he replied hesitantly. A burst of laughter came through the comms then, laughter filled with relief and joy. "It is you! Damn it all! We thought we'd lost you forever. Hold tight. We're coming down." David barely had time to process what was happening before one of the human ships descended into the clearing just outside the settlement's walls. Its ramp lowered with a hiss of hydraulics, and a group of soldiers emerged, his old squad mates from the Intergalactic Army. Carter was at their head, a tall woman with sharp features and a grin that could light up a room even in moments like this. She jogged toward him without hesitation and pulled him into a tight hug before stepping back to look him over. "You look different," she said with a smirk, gesturing toward his alien armor and faintly glowing tattoo mark on his arm. "You look exactly the same," David replied with a laugh that felt lighter than anything he'd experienced in months. The rest of his squad crowded around him then, slapping him on the back, ruffling his hair what little there was left, bombarding him with questions about where he'd been and how he'd survived all this time. And through it all, Seris watched silently from nearby. When Carter finally stepped back again to give David some breathing room, she glanced at Seris and raised an eyebrow. "And who's this?" David turned towards Seris instinctively, and for once found himself at a loss for words. How could he explain who she was, what she meant to him? Seris stepped forward then, her posture regal as always, and inclined her head slightly in greeting. "I am Seris," she said simply but firmly, "queen and captain of this place." Carter's eyebrows shot up at that, but wisely chose not to comment further beyond offering her own nod in return. The hours that followed were filled with celebration, a rare thing among warriors, but one they all embraced wholeheartedly after such an unexpected victory without casualties on their side. David introduced Seris properly to his squad mates during those celebrations, and though there were moments when cultural differences led to awkwardness or confusion, it became clear quickly enough that mutual respect would bridge any gaps between them all eventually, over time, ahead together now united stronger than ever. And as night fell once again upon horizon above, glowing trees below twin moons shining brightly overhead sky alike, David found himself standing beside Seris once more atop same tower where they'd awaited battle earlier today, now instead awaiting brighter tomorrow ahead together, finally free, burden passed behind forever.